I really liked Jacob's introduction to the academy because I think what he said about crisis is really important, because when you look back on the last 20, 30 years, you'll find that the word crisis is one of the most overused terms, which basically attaches itself to the most banal issues. And at the same time, what he says about stasis is really quite important, because stasis does capture an aspect of our lives. I don't use the word stasis in my head. Instead, I prefer to use the term the frenetic present, a present which is continually at ease with itself and continually rushes to a certain point and then kind of moves back. I think the more I read and the more I study, the more I realize how important history is, once we understand what history is really all about. And in particular, I've come to the conclusion that it's the dispossession of our society from historical thought that often lends itself to an incapacity to understand what is real, or at the very least to distance ourselves all the time from all kinds of experiences. If any of you listened to the debate last night between the Tory candidates, that kind of air of unreality, that kind of robotic, media-trained answers shows you just how much there is their world, and there's a world that's kind of unfolding, both behind our backs, but also, in a sense, confronting us what we're saying. What I like to do at this discussion is today look at the question of historical consciousness and its problems and its loss. And in another lecture, I'll be talking about the question of the consciousness of agency. And I want to suggest by the time I'm finished that these two things are very much interconnected. They interweave with one another in a very profound way. You can't have one without the other, because historical consciousness, the capacity to think historically, the ability to see how the world unfolds and changes, to be able to see sort of the tension between what has gone on beforehand and what goes on now, that capacity is really quite important for us to understand our lives in the here and now. Unfortunately, history has got a very bad reputation. It's seen as something to do with nostalgia, the good old days, and things that have occurred a long, long, long time ago, without understanding that it is an essential foundational intellectual resource on which our perception can be rooted in something really, really firm. So my subject this morning is historical consciousness and the ability to think historically. I also want to explain why its loss, leading to historical amnesia, is so consequential. And I will look at how amnesia regarding the past leads to a break in historical continuity, which has led to geopolitical illiteracy. And finally, I want to explain and discuss how its loss has led to the moral disarmament of the West, and why that is a very important concept for us to grasp. Now, many of these trends have been in place for decades. They're not necessarily something that kicked in yesterday, but it was only with the February invasion of Ukraine that has led to their crystallization, so that today many of these trends are much more visible to people. They acquired a certain tangible quality, and therefore people who not so long ago declared that history has ended now talk openly about its return. I think that's the way it works. Sometimes certain events occur which almost kind of have a displacement on material reality, to the point at which we can see something that was there all along, but for a variety of reasons was invisible to our imagination. The difficulty of thinking historically is always paralleled by the erosion of historical continuity. And I think it's this confusion about temporality temporality that relates in the relationship between the past and the present and the future that often leads to some very distorted way of understanding the world. So one of the principal expression of a confusion regarding temporality is the conviction on the part of many people, and it's something that's deeply integrated into Western culture, that suggests that what happened in the past is irrelevant today. That the past is the past. It's got no relevance to our lives in the present, except in an entirely kind of nostalgic, sort of banal sense. But what's interesting is that the very same people that declare that what happened in the past is irrelevant also go on to say that today, the world that we live in today, is relevant to the remaking of the past. And one of the interesting things about Western culture today is that we're spending a lot of our energy remaking the past. And the way that we try to remake the past is by, in a sense, projecting onto the past the values of our moment at present, and through projecting our values to what happened in the past begins to look very, very different than we ever imagined. So, for example, we have a situation today where there's a big discussion amongst medievalists. Now, the medieval age was a long, long, long time ago, even longer than my life, even before I was born. And yet there are all these academics in the United States who are very busy involving themselves in a project to decolonize the Middle Ages. And they have serious discussions about decolonizing the Middle Ages, as they have serious discussion about changing the vocabulary of the Latin language. Because apparently the Latin language and ancient Rome have still yet to come to terms with slavery. Why didn't they come to terms with slavery? And there are all these discussions which basically ask the question, why did the Christian fathers, Saint Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, why did they not denounce slavery? And that's being held against them as a kind of demonstration that there was something deeply flawed in the way that they thought. So we got this interesting confusion about temporality, where we basically say that the past is irrelevant, but at the same time we think the present and the values of the present can be useful tools to remake the past, to fix the problems of the past. And I think that fantasy about the fact that what happened in the past has no bearing on today, but it's the other way around. What happens today has bearing on the past. A complete reversal of reality leads to the most incredible fantasies, forms of magical thinking that are taken as the truth. So, for example, when I was writing my book on the Ukraine, I was very interested in what people were saying about the possibility of wars breaking out in Europe. And I was particularly interested in it because I knew that Europe has been a continent that's been fully engulfed in wars, for centuries. That's what European civilization was really all about, one war after another. And yet, by the 1980s, by the 1990s, certainly after the Cold War, there's a whole literature about the fact that wars in Europe are unthinkable. If you remember, one of the claims made by the Remain lobby during Brexit was that the EU prevents war. It just brings peace to Europe. There are actual books with the title about how wars have become obsolescent. And the argument is that from now onwards, we're just going to have cyber wars or asymmetric wars, or maybe a few wars in Africa and Libya or places like that, but certainly not in Europe. So just pause for a second. Here you have serious experts in international relations writing books about the obsolescence of war, and fully convinced, absolutely fully convinced that that's it. And of course, if wars are obsolescent, then it's got all kinds of consequences. You don't need security, you don't need borders, you don't really need armies, you certainly don't need national service. You don't certainly need courage to fight. And it's interesting, if you look at the different surveys that have been carried out in Europe about what percentage of the population would be prepared to fight if they were invaded by a foreign enemy. And as you would expect, anybody know which country's got the highest? Finland, absolutely right. And the lowest? The Dutch. I mean, they would be it would be the Dutch, sort of, Dutch courage, that kind of stuff, So it's not just prejudice. Anyways, the idea that Europe has become exempted from conflicts and is a war-free zone then lends itself to the fantasy that we don't need borders. Open borders are perfectly all right because we don't really have to worry about anything to do with security or issues of that sort. Now, the belief that Europe had escaped from history, that somehow we're kind of left history behind, we're kind of done with it, did not emerge spontaneously. It wasn't the case that somehow, through the changing forms of material reality, we now drew the conclusion that we're now in a different era, we've escaped from the past. The idea that Europe had become escaped from history was a result of political and cultural struggles that occurred throughout the last 100 years. And to put my argument in its baldest form, the 100 years of culture war that I described in my recent book was actually systematically focused on delegitimating the past. And even today, when you look at what's called cancel culture and all these horrible names that we've gifted the culture war, when you scratch the surface and you look beneath, they're all an attempt to distance society from its past legacies. It's very much an attempt to somehow insist and assert that what we have is something very, very new. Now, during the era of ideological rivalries between communism, socialism, fascism, Nazism, liberalism, during the era of ideologies, this trend was not so visible. And it is interesting when you look back at the literature of the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, all the way to essentially the 80s, how rarely some of the really important foundational struggles that are imbued with cultural issues, how rarely they're expressly discussed in those terms. It's very, very rare. Yet some authors have addressed the problem merely in passing or marginally, but by and large, we were fixated on ideology. And we almost imagine that ideologies have this kind of permanence to them, that even though it might not be strong today, but nevertheless, we feel free to call people fascists. We feel free to call people cultural Marxists. So we kind of eternalize these ideological concepts and turn them into a generic form. But at the same time, what isn't really discussed is the fact that very often these ideologies are mutated expressions of very clear cultural positions, particularly in relation to the past. I think the best example that I can think of is that of Italian fascism. Italian fascism, which very often is kind of described by illiterate historians or historically illiterate historians. Italian fascism is described as very nationalistic. It's meant to be very conservative. All the anti-populist writers today who denounce populism as fascism talk about how nostalgic populists are. They always want to recreate the past. I wonder if any of them actually read a fascist text. I mean, it's available online. It's worth reading. You don't need to be scared about it. If you actually read a fascist text written by a kind of a signed-up fascist, who is completely committed to that idea, I wonder if you actually read any of those texts, because if you read them, you'll find that what they're saying is very, very different. You'll find, for example, that Mussolini or Gentile were continually talking about the need to create a new Italy. They were disgusted with the old Italy. They were disgusted with the Italian past. The last thing they wanted was to be nostalgic about that decadent, corrupt Italy that came about after Risorgimento. That's the last thing they wanted. And when you read Mussolini, what does he talk about? He talks about creating a new man. He's talking about creating a new Rome. In other words, their sort of cultural outlook was thoroughly saturated with modernism. It was a modernist, future-oriented utopia that they were building. And although they occasionally talked about how brilliant it is to be Italian, their whole outlook was culturally very much to distance Italian society from the past. And you'll know, for example, that when Gramsci was imprisoned and was writing to his son, and his son was saying that he wants to become a technocrat, likes engineering, he doesn't want to do classics because that's so old, Latin and Greek. Gramsci actually is the one that says Mussolini and education is wrong. You need to be rooted in the classical history of Western civilization. So it's interesting how that kind of misreading of ideologies has gone on and is very rarely discussed properly. But that's what happens when you have historical amnesia, which is the consequence of a loss of historical consciousness. I think historical amnesia today is one of the most profound problems of our time because it closes our eyes to what is really out there. One of the ways in which historical amnesia expresses itself is, as Jacob was suggesting earlier on, through the ideology of endism. And endism has become a very veritable ideology. I mean, just look at the number of developments that have been declared has not come to an end. The number of times we hear about the end of history, the end of ideology, the end of the nation state, the end of sovereignty, books written in America about the end of democracy. The number of endisms that you find is truly phenomenal. And what lies behind this casual way in which things are declared to be at an end, what lies behind this is this inability to understand that historical continuity cannot just be sort of whitewashed out of existence. That historical continuity in some shape or form will continue to influence the temper of our times, even though it might not be visible to you. And in many respects, when you have books published like The Strange Death of Democracy and How Democracy Has Come to an End, what they are really saying is that public life itself is at an end. And sometimes I'm not sure whether that's wishful thinking on their part, or they actually believe that this is the end of public life. From their standpoint, the current conflicts, such as the war in Ukraine, are not really connected to the forces of history, which were unleashed in the early decades of the 20th century. They cannot see how some of the unresolved questions that kind of emerged in the aftermath of the First World War continue to exercise influence over the way that tensions are playing themselves out in that region. The historical memory is so weak that after the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, they thought that was it. Right? That was the end. That was it. Now we're moving on to a different phase. They cannot really see the connection between what happened after the First World War to the 2014 invasion and to what's going on now. Because in their mind, these issues have been resolved after the Cold War, the end of history, by which they mean a complete break in the patterns and the dynamics of these developments. They don't understand that after the First World War, you had the German question, which actually dominated European society. The German question was really about the inability of Europe to integrate Germany and into itself and into the global patterns of international relations. Germany was far too big to be just another European country, but it was a little bit too small and lacked the power to be a genuine global player in the way Britain was at one time and America later on. And even when the German question was resolved, as it was resolved after unification of Germany in some shape or form, they failed to understand that the German question merely gave way to the Russian question. Because just as Germany could not be integrated into the European and a kind of balance of power system and international balance of power system, neither could Russia, because Russia was also, for a variety of different reasons, was also too big to be just another Poland or to be just another Romania or just another European country. But it was too small to actually play the kind of role that its leaders and its people expected of it. And its position remained in a tenuous circumstance given the balance of power situation that we have. And the Russian question is still with us. It's not going to go away anytime soon, regardless of the outcome of this particular phase of the war against Ukraine. So you have historical amnesia kind of kicking in, which in part, in the more recent decades, has been inspired by the need to forget the interwar era, and particularly the tragedy and the tragic events surrounding the Second World War. One of the things that's happened as a byproduct of this kind of amnesia towards our history is that a number of concepts have been lost, or become an object of pathology. So we have a situation where after Second World War, geopolitics became a dirty word, and geopolitics was increasingly seen as something associated with fascism, rather than with a realistic appraisal of the balance of power situation. And once geopolitics becomes a dirty word, obviously that explains why diplomacy and traditional forms of diplomatic behavior also become weaker and lose their foundation in reality. You have, as a result of that experience, a freedom to be hostile to the nation state. And where the nation state and its authority becomes increasingly framed in a negative light at that particular point. You have a situation where, and it really hit me because I went to a discussion in Poland about 5 years ago, and that was the first time I heard people positively talk about national interests and the need to pursue national interests. And it occurred to me that actually in other parts of the world, the term national interest has also become a negative expression. There's something really wrong with pursuing your national interest. Why don't you pursue a humanitarian, goody-goody kind of diplomacy instead? You have sovereignty being declared as being negative and problematic. And the literature that's devoted towards pathologizing these concepts has really flourished all the time. These sentiments have been systematically codified into the ideology of globalism, which is different than globalism, because globalism or globalization has got a basis in material reality. It's something that is real and still continued. But globalism and a globalized sort of project is principally an ideological form. And what has happened as part of this process is that globalism as an ideology has become a really important ideological resource for the elites. It really hit me how distorting this ideology becomes. A couple of months ago, I reread Fukuyama. Reread is putting it too strongly. I flipped through Fukuyama's famous book on the end of history. I just thought, why not? And I forget when it was written, but it was written just at the end of the Cold War. And I didn't realize just how much his writings on the end of history was influenced by this ideology of globalism and globalization, and how distorting its effect is. This is what he says. And it really something I didn't pick up at the time, because you don't always pick up the important things until many years later. It says this: I believe that the European Union more accurately reflects what the world will look like at the end of history than the contemporary United States. The EU's attempt to transcend sovereignty and traditional power politics by establishing a transnational rule of law is much more in line with a post-historical world than the Americans' continuing belief in God, national sovereignty, and their military. I don't know how I missed that, but then I've been missing a lot of things over the years. But it is interesting how, in that statement, Fukuyama interweaves everything that there is about the issues that we're discussing. And that from his perspective, this is written in early 1990s, he sees the European Union as the realization of history. It's come to an end. And he uses the word, which is the flip side of the ideology of endism, which is the post word. So he talks about what he calls the post-historical world, a world that trumps America's old-fashioned kind of convictions about believing in God, national sovereignty, and their military. And it's interesting how he interweaves these three things. Right? Just pause on this for a second. Continuing belief. I mean, I'm an atheist, so it's not exactly that I'm trying to, sort of sell you God. But basically, it says continuing belief in God, national sovereignty, and their military. Why connect these three things about America? It's an interesting connection that he's making. And what he's really getting at is not just a world that's post-historical and post-sovereignty, but also post-heroic. And something I want to talk about tomorrow a little bit, the whole post-heroic mentality that kind of comes out of that. Now, since Ukraine, there has been a backlash against the globalized ideology and this kind of ignoring of history. But I think the backlash against it has been fairly superficial. It's been a kind of, maybe we were wrong, without actually examining and exploring the premise on which globalized ideology was founded on, and in particular upon the whole phenomenon of historical amnesia, which isn't just simply about globalization, but much more than that. So I want to kind of link these developments to what I call the moral disarmament of the West. It's a concept that I've been working on and playing around with for some time. And I think it's a very important concept. It's not something that is discussed very much. There's a few references to it in relation to the aftermath of the First World War, pacifism, the appeasement ideologies that developed in France and England in reaction to Nazism, the failure of the League of Nations. Occasionally there are references to it, but I did a literature search on moral disarmament. I could only find one book with the title, and that's on French education, and a few references here and there, but not in the way that I use it, and not in the way that I sort of try to make sense of it. Because for me, moral disarmament is really moral disarmament. It isn't just simply being a bit pacifist, isn't being a little bit cowardly. It's something a little bit more profound and more extensive than that. So I think moral disarmament of the West is the direct outcome of these culture wars that underpin and lead to this disdain for history. They were something that rumbled throughout the interwar era. And in the domain of public life, its most remarkable symptom was the growing indifference to the authority of the nation state, and the way in which the nation state was seen as something outdated, something that should be simply kind of rejected. And in a sense, what happens is that when you begin to become so estranged from the nation state and its authority, then it's also the case that you're creating the basis for a political crisis, particularly a political crisis of democracies. Now, if you see the nation state in such kind of negative or kind of quizzical kind of a way, then what becomes interconnected with it are that a number of values that are essentially public values founded on a public or a community also become negotiable and very often become emptied of meaning. So, for example, one of the things that we see as a result of this consensus, this anti-historical consensus, is that just as in the case of Fukuyama, you have a constellation of civic virtues such as patriotism, duty, service, solidarity, whose status today are less and less validated by the dominant institutions of society. Now, when I say that, they become less validated, I don't mean that people go out and argue explicitly against duty or service or solidarity. They might do against patriotism. But by and large, nobody explicitly tries to attack it. But its internal meaning, what it really means, becomes feebler and feebler all the time. It becomes gradually more and more emptied of meaning with the passing of time. And this kind of moral disarmament, whereby civic virtues, public values become essentially weaken loses its power to grip the imagination, are particularly important in the sphere of education. Whereas I argued in my book on 100 Years of Identity Crisis, they are less and less used to socialize young people so that the younger generations do not become acquainted with it and certainly do not learn to take them seriously. Now, one of the consequences of this is that once you have this kind of dynamic put in place, what you have is that the normative foundations for public life create a condition where values, what people call values, become a source of conflict rather than serving as an instrument of unity. I think one of the phenomena that has kicked in for 40, 50 years is any discussion of values no longer becomes a way of creating solidarity. They kind of initiate, they kind of kick off tensions and conflict. And I think that this fragmentation that comes about as a result of the moral disarmament of society is that this fragmentation diminishes the capacity of the ruling elites to acquire the ability to be a cohesive and a purposeful group. Now, these conflicts over values that I'm describing, which appear to be entirely domestic and entirely to do with culture, actually have profound geopolitical consequences. And I think it's important to realize that these two things are intimately interweaved in reality. So conflicts over values leading to a palpable sense of disunity have very important geopolitical effects. And you can see this that, with the estrangement of sections of the Western political establishment from the ideal of national interest, partly explains its lack of clarity and ability to engage with the challenge posed by foreign adversaries. Because once you sort of lose sight of who you are, where you're coming from, what is it that you're defending, then your orientation towards what happens outside of your community or nation changes very, very, very importantly. And certainly, and this is something I've been working on for a few months, the elites of Western society today appear to be far less effective than their counterparts were in the 1950s or even the 1960s. This development is particularly significant in relation to the United States, where the government is often paralyzed in self-inflicted gridlock. So humiliating setbacks in Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, and Libya suggest that so-called power elites are conspicuously unable to exercise their power effectively. There's a wonderful book on this by an American historian called Richard Lachman. And in one of his quotes, one of his paragraphs, Richard Lachman says, America is unique among the world's dominant powers of the past 500 years, in its repeated failure to achieve military objectives over decades. Those failures are even more extraordinary because they occurred in the absence of a rising military rival. So in other words, what Lachman is saying, what's really interesting, is that not only is the failure of America to achieve any of its military objectives, but that this failure occurs in the context that there's nobody comparable that America is fighting against. Right? I mean, Vietnam, the war in Vietnam in America is not like Germany and the United States, which is roughly equals. We're talking about some very different kind of countries. When you look at the humiliation of America in Afghanistan or Syria, never mind Libya, we're not talking about a serious rival, but yet, despite the absence of a serious rival, why is it that the American power elites turn out to be so powerless? What is really kind of going on here? And I think that this failure is the consequence of some of the things that I mentioned. And it seems to me that it is the weak normative foundation for the exercise of elite power that has led to the absence of a l'esprit de corps and a sense of legitimacy which plays such a decisive role in the foreign affair failures of the West. Now, Lachman's closely argued study of the ineffectiveness of the international projection of American power raises questions that we might ask in relation to similar problems in the Western world, domestic problems, for example, such as the unsuccessful initiatives like the war on drugs. Have you ever heard of the war on drugs? Or the war on poverty? Or the war on terrorism? And all these initiatives, whether they're in education or social cohesion, all these initiatives are singularly inept. They've never seemed to be able to achieve any of their objectives. I mean, you compare that to Roosevelt's New Deal in the 1930s. I mean, at least with the New Deal, you did have these big dams afterwards. You had these big public projects afterwards. You had actual, real results. Whereas today, when the elites promise something, you know for sure that it's not going to get done. That's the one thing you can be absolutely sure about. And I thought it was interesting because in yesterday's debate between the Tory candidates, the most overused word was that of delivery. They were all delivering. They sound like pizza delivery guys, we'll deliver, is what they said. And I think that you and I know that whenever they promise to deliver, right, you're going to be waiting a very, very long time before that metaphorical pizza arrives. Now, don't want to take up very much time, but it's very clear to me that recent developments, most forcefully expressed in the invasion of Ukraine, indicate that you cannot ignore history forever. And certainly, if you look back at what I would now call the Russian question, which I don't want to spend too much time on, or any time on really, when you look at the way in which Russia has been mishandled ever since the Cold War, the way it's been integrated into the world, and the stupidity, the silly idea that somehow economical trade and neoliberal sort of commercial activities will sort out historical problems to do with geopolitics, tells us that this is not going to go away anytime soon. And that whatever happens this year or next year in this war, it will continue for a much, much longer time, simply because you cannot somehow pretend that those historical forces can be put aside without there being any kind of security or military-related consequence. And it seems to me that for us to understand, to come to terms with this reality that we're now going through, is a very important opportunity, because now that history is beginning to return, it never went away, but now that people see that it's playing some kind of an important role, we can begin to sort of challenge and question some of these assumptions that have been built up over a very long period of time. I think that the key thing that I want to end on is by saying that for society to overcome its impasse, it must have greater clarity about where we have come from. We must really understand the origins of the world that we live in and the way that it differs from the world that we live in now, but also the way that there are things that are connected. I was in Finland last week, which is Finland is really aware of all these things, obviously, because you see Russia a few miles away from you. Finland was interesting because everybody in Finland, all the young people, are signing up to join the security forces or the volunteer forces. People talk about nothing else than history. Even I said, look, let's talk about something else, sort of. And it's a very interesting experience. You learn a lot, and you realize that in some parts of the world, by the force of circumstances, history doesn't really go away. But now and again, you hear something that stays with you. And I haven't stopped thinking about what somebody told me. And I just want to end on her word, because in a discussion with her, she says, Frank, what do you think of Goethe? And I said, does he play for Spurs or Man United? I wasn't really that sure. What do you think of Goethe? And I said, he's a smart guy, I like some of his literature. I says, what do you think of when he said this? And she kind of quoted me something from Goethe, which I want to end on. I don't want to explain what I think about it. Have a think about this, and we'll come back to it at the end. This is what Goethe says. He says, there are only two lasting bequests we can hope to give our children. One of these is roots, the other wings. Thank you.